Okay, for more on Peter Sloly's testimony and what else we heard throughout the week, former Deputy RCMP Commissioner Pierre-Yves Bourduas is with me. It is great to meet you in person. We spoke many times during this convoy. Right. Look, the testimony's still going on. I mean, what stood out to you from what you heard today?
So far, what stood out is the fact that Sloly at the outset indicated that most of his decision, operational and otherwise, were intelligence-led. And he really put the emphasis on the fact that he focused on intelligence, what the intelligence meant to him and to his police organization, and how the plan predicated upon this intel. And of course, what really stood out to me is the fact that there were signals. He's acknowledged the fact that on January 13th, he already had an intel report highlighting the fact that there were discussions about a potential convoy. And then when the convoy started on January 26th from Del to BC, there were other intel reports coming in his direction, highlighting the fact that this was going to be a serious event.
Right, so how do you square that? He says it was intel-led, and the intelligence, mostly from the Ontario Provincial Police, the Herndon reports we keep hearing about, said, get ready, it's going to be big, there's no exit plan, they're going to stay. And even now, he's testifying that none of this was proof of what was going to happen was going to happen. How do you square that?
And it's pretty hard to look at the facts. Of course, hindsight 2020 is always wonderful, but the reality is that the chief highlighted some internal pressure because even before the convoy arrived in Ottawa, there were a lot of internal, he indicated that the membership were tired of cultural transition and so on and so forth, and that he indicated that he believed strongly that this was going to be just a short event, when in fact it certainly was not the case.
You talked about the internal issues. One thing that became very clear throughout his testimony today is there was a lack of trust and communication at the executive levels of the police force, at the superintendent, inspector, deputy chief, chief level. I mean, what does that do to a police force when that very top level of the chain of command, they seem to be talking past each other or flat out mistrusting and fighting with each other?
Well, it does what we all witness happened when a set of circumstances, intel report, red flags are going up in relation to this convoy that everybody could watch on the national news, like was heading towards Ottawa, and then nothing was done. There's a mantra within police organization whereas looking at intelligence, you always plan for the worst, and you hope for the best. And in this particular instance, there was just one scenarios, and it was going to be a short weekend affair, when in fact it's certainly not what was the case.
Right, they planned for the best, is really, if you look at it. And what I find interesting is that he still seemed to suggest that it was the right response given what they knew, and almost as if he's a victim of circumstance here. And I just wonder, obviously reputation management and rehabilitation has been a big part of his lawyers' efforts throughout this inquiry. Correct. I mean, do you think he helped himself today with the way he explained how he approached this?
Well, again, there were some statements that baffled me up to a certain point, where all the signals seems to be pointing in the direction of an occupation as opposed to a mere protest. And also, part of the testimony, and I was actually dumbfounded when I saw the trucks coming in on Wellington, and all of a sudden, you have a legal opinion that was presented to him today, and there were 5 points that he highlighted were discussed prior to the arrival of the convoy, all the legal aspects of truck occupying and preventing, for instance, emergency vehicles to circulate within downtown Ottawa, and yet he didn't appear to indicate that meant a whole lot to him in the larger scheme of things, and for me that was baffling.
So like a week into this, we've seen a bunch of evidence, the text exchanges between RCMP Commissioner Brenda Lucki and Tom Carrique, the Commissioner of the Ontario Provincial Police. February 5th, we're a week into this, and she's saying, my bosses, the federal government is losing confidence or has lost confidence in the Ottawa Police Service. I think they may bring in the Emergencies Act, and that puts one of us in charge, and I don't want to deal with that. I mean, what does it tell you so quickly that a week in, the federal government is already discussing the Emergencies Act, according to Brenda Lucki's texts?
Well, it's interesting. I was in a similar position managing other operational issues, and I call it the greasy nexus between policing and politics.
Right.
And this particular nexus was quite evident when the text from one commissioner to the OPP to the RCMP and RCMP to OPP, it was clear and evident that there were a lot of political pressure that was building up after that first weekend. And it kept building up to the point where we ended up in a situation in Windsor and then the situation in Coutts, Alberta. So it was actually, this particular occupation was actually getting momentum.
Right, and so 10 days after this text, we get this testimony from Tom Carrique yesterday that him and Lucki discussed and said it's time to go talk to Slowly and ask if he wants me to take over, me being Carrique, the head of the OPP, and if Slowly wasn't going to accept that or come up with a new way, he was going to go to the Deputy Solicitor General, essentially, I don't want to call it a coup, but it's force a change of command.
Correct.
Now, Slowly resign, but like, what does it tell you that it got to this point that the provincial policing force was prepared to go to the provincial cabinet and say, you got to get this guy out of here?
And that is troubling. Of all my years as a police officer and even as a consultant with public safety, I've never heard of a situation that critical, whereas you're talking about the commissioner of the OPP that actually wants to put someone out of office and take over. That was, in my opinion, a desperate move, desperate conversation, because it was obviously a desperate situation.
So help me understand this. A failure to read the intelligence in advance, a loss of control of the downtown streets of the capital city, federal government rapidly losing faith in the local police services to the point that eventually higher levels of policing were ready to make a move to have him forced out. Yet everybody from policing forces say, we still had options available, we hadn't exhausted policing options, we didn't need the Emergencies Act, and this was an occupation that lasted longer than the Winter Olympics, which went on at the same time. I mean, what should the public draw from that? That the police forces are still so confident that they had the capacity to deal with this when clearly they had been totally unable to deal with it to this point?
Well, I'll tell you, David, ask the 15,000 people that were held hostage downtown whether or not they thought that police had enough tools in their toolbox to solve this problem, because for over 3 weeks, they didn't see anything change with regards to this particular situation until after the Emergencies Act was enacted. And then from that point on, then things started moving. Two key elements, in my opinion, that made this thing move is the fact that, first of all, there was all discussions around tow truck drivers. It was clear from the outset that tow truck drivers wouldn't get involved unless they'd be forced by law, which wasn't the case prior to the Emergencies Act. The second point is when you hit people in the pocketbook, they pay attention.
Freezing bank accounts.
Exactly. And some of these truckers, once they realized that the Emergencies Act had personal financial impact on some of them, they started moving their rigs. So, you know, this discussion around, we had enough tools, I'm sure that the 15 or plus thousand citizens of the city of Ottawa would not agree with that particular statement.
And there's also the reality on the ground. Bylaw officers told not to issue tickets for fear of their safety. Police officers told not to intercept gas deliveries because they were being swarmed and it wasn't safe. So these are law enforcement options, ticketing, seizing, arresting, and towing, that simply weren't being used up to this point. So I just wonder, based on where we are now, as a final point, do you think the Emergencies Act was necessary? That was the only way it was going to get done.
As far as I'm concerned, yes, because of the reason that I've highlighted and the fact that there was a bit of desperation in this particular situation. And it was highlighted by the discussion between the Commissioner of the OPP and the Commissioner of the RCMP, and the need that they realize we need to move this person in order to get things going.
Okay. All right, PY, thanks so much. I'm sure we're going to talk again about this. Thanks for coming in today.
My pleasure.
So that is former Deputy RCMP Commissioner Pierre-Yves Bourduas.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.